Mr. Mike Henning. How you doing today, sir?
Good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, Mike. I think we need to settle this debate first before we really get into anything serious. And that is the question of what is the best white collar slash fraud based movie?
Oh, man, that is a good question. There's actually a movie when I was actually doing a little research on this from the question you had asked me earlier on email. There's a new movie that came out. It's a true story about someone who committed fraud within their town of Dixon, and it happened, I think, within the last 10 years. It was the controller of Dixon stole about 53 to 56 million dollars from her town, her small town of Dixon, over 10 to 20 years. So I think
Oh,
that's a pretty good movie and a pretty good
what's
example.
what's the name of the movie, Mike?
It's a documentary. I think it's the Horse Queen, because she
Okay.
was known to compete in these horse competitions where jumping, showing horses, and things like that.
All right. Is that on Netflix?
It is on Netflix. Yeah.
It feels like a Netflix doc. I was going to go with, again, on the more lesser known side of things. I just watched it recently. It's an HBO original, Bad Education, starring Hugh Jackman. I think they did
Oh,
like 10 million in like public school embezzlement.
you nailed it. That is a perfect example of crime. And that's where a lot of crime happens in the public sector because they're struggling with funds. A lot of the employees within the public and governmental sector, they're doing a lot of work for sometimes not as competitive as pay as they could get in the private sector.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty fascinating watch, for sure. And you're surprised. I guess I wasn't really aware of how many, white collar crime movies there were. A lot of them star Leonardo DiCaprio for some reason until you actually start to think about it. And I think they do serve as like you said, a good example as to the conditions that, kind of create the environment that compel somebody to take these sort of actions because it's something that you think, it's never going to happen. Like it's not going to be the thing that's going to happen here. But what do you think is maybe the thing that business owners kind of overlook or try to just pretend like they're not seeing the most when it comes to potential fraud cases in their company?
Well, I think business owners look at two things. One, a business owner, and for that fact, the people that you work with, whether you're the owner, the manager, or just the employee, you don't like to think of the people that you hire, the people that you work with, as being dishonest. The other factor that business owners face constantly, but especially in a time like now, is trying to figure out how to getting the best bang for their buck, being very efficient with their costs and expenses. So, for example, right now, there's a lot of companies that are furloughing and laying off employees. And what that's doing is putting a lot more responsibility and a lot more duties from the furloughed or laid off employees onto the employees that are still there. I've spoken to agents about this, and a lot of agents will say, those employees are just happy that they have a job. I think that assumption has some truth to it, but there's also some inaccuracy to that too. Whereas a lot of those employees now look at, now I'm doing more work for the same amount of money. So now they have a little bit of contention. They have appreciation for having their job, but they also have contention for doing more for less. And they think they should be paid maybe a little bit more or gotten a raise or something like that, or a bigger bonus. And now they have the ability, because they are able to control more of the process, to find out how to embezzle funds and how to cover it up. So they sometimes can justify maybe taking a small amount of money at first and think of it as just a part of their pay now, and think that they're in the right of doing that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because not only are they like you mentioned in the bad education scenario, not only are they doing more work, but sometimes the pay they might have felt, everybody feels underpaid in some way, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
you add more work, you talk about the whole like, hey, maybe I'm not getting what I'm worth. Do you have any sort of idea what the likelihood or the percentages that, a business is looking to face a potential fraud or embezzlement situation? I mean, how many businesses does this happen to across the board?
I mean, every business out there, every organization, whether it's public, private, nonprofit, governmental, financial institution, everyone's susceptible to fraud. And especially with crime insurance, you're covering against human behavior. And even with experts, that's a very hard thing to calculate and figure out. you just don't know what people are truly honestly feeling and thinking all the time, and what different motivations, pains, and struggles they're having in their personal life that may cause them to start to embezzle funds from their company or their organization.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I believe you spent some time in the world of underwriting crime. And what were some of the things that you saw that you looked at and said, "Oh, this might be, a situation that feels a little more fertile for, potential crime"? Is there something that businesses can do to kind of spot the environments that they create? Or, I mean, because I would imagine that this is something that is not even like 10th or 11th on the list when they think of kind of changes that they're making to the company. If I do this, I'm setting myself up for a potential, fraud or, crime case within my business.
Yeah, I did spend just under 10 years underwriting crime insurance. So I did have a fair amount of experience underwriting it and seeing a variety of different types of losses. And there's a variety of different reasons why people start to commit these acts. Some of it has to do with what the employee thinks is fair. And so they just want to be paid what they feel like they're worth. So then they will supplement what they're not being paid through what they're going to take. And I think I kind of touched on that already. Sometimes there's family businesses where it could be a disagreement between brothers that was personal within the family. And the brother that maybe is on the lower end of the totem pole within the organization's like, you know what? Now it's time for me to get back at my brother. And this is what will hurt him. And then there's others who go into interview and go into an organization with the sole reason of embezzling funds because they see that there's a greater opportunity within this organization to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the family business is probably, I would imagine, one of the most likely scenarios because there's a birth level trust across the people that have control, depending on how the relationship is. But
yeah.
Talking about
Thanksgiving, and then that explodes, and then bam, here's crap.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of family businesses with auto dealerships, and that's where we were, when I was underwriting, a little more conservative with those types of risks.
There's another industry that has a lot of family businesses. I don't know if anybody told you, Mike, but insurance has quite a few. I'm not sure. What the penetration rate is on commercial crime policies for independent agencies, but maybe it's something to look into. Well, the other thing is that, this is something that can happen for a long time before it is discovered. What is the likely timeframes that these occurrences kind of go on? And maybe what are some of the things that business owners should be paying attention to? What are things agents should be telling their clients to be looking out for when it comes to trying to prevent the longevity of these things kind of happening?
First part of the question is a crime loss is kind of death by a thousand cuts. It is usually starts off at a small amount at one occurrence, but then the amounts escalate over time. And a crime loss really usually lasts. They typically last between 3, 5, 7 years, and that's why the losses typically are at 6 figures and can easily get into 7 figures without even knowing it. In terms of what owners and managers and executives need to look out for and how to help prevent losses in that side, a lot of it is, making sure, one, there's checks and balances in place, dual approvals, separating the critical duties in your organization amongst people. Don't overload someone with too much responsibility. Give them the ability to commit the loss and cover it up, especially in accounting, vendor approvals, and vendor management. That's where a lot of the losses come from within payments and vendors in accounting, and also payroll with ghost employees and things like that. So it's really important to make sure the duties are appropriately separated between the employees so one employee doesn't have too much responsibility. I can't tell you how many times, especially within a religious entity, where that's a higher risk for crime. And sorry to say that because you'll have an employee who controls all the accounting, and he or she is the first one in and the last one to leave. And then when they retire, we find out there was a 7-figure loss that they'd been stealing. And there's so much cash that's being funneled in through donations. It's very easy to embezzle money from an organization like that.
Yeah, let's maybe dive into the actual coverage itself, because I guess maybe first, where would you gauge just the overall awareness for, crime coverage for a business? Is this something that they're actively thinking about? Is this something that you're seeing agents push heavily? Where is just the overall general acceptance level at right now?
Crime coverage has been around for a very long time. It's an old coverage. Back to the point of an owner never really, or a business owner never really likes to think that their employees that they hire are doing anything wrong. So sometimes an owner will not purchase crime coverage because they don't think they need it, because they trust their employees and everything's fine. But I would still say for the most part, crime is still purchased by many businesses. I would say well over 75% of businesses. It just depends upon what kind of crime product you're purchasing. And like any other product in the management liability space, D&O, EPL, cyber, fiduciary, if you're buying it within a BOP or a package policy, you're really only checking a box. And you're not really buying a coverage that's going to appropriately cover you. If you really want to buy a product, a crime product that will appropriately cover you and the exposures that you have, a standalone product is the way to go. That is something that it's important to have, but I also know that crime, in the terms of premium within the management liability space, it's a smaller ticket item. So sometimes that's the reason why there isn't as much attention devoted to it, and it can be sometimes overlooked. When I can't tell you how many times I've seen full limit losses because the risk wasn't appropriately evaluated for, the exposures weren't really analyzed and reviewed, and it wasn't the right product or the right limit wasn't purchased. So even though the premium is a smaller amount versus some of the other products within the management liability space, it's still just as essentially important as any of those other products, because the losses can just, 6 figures, 7 figures, that speaks on its own.
What about those coverages that you think are important that, again, maybe go overlooked, that people don't take into consideration when they're saying, hey, just check this box just to, make sure we've got it? To have like a little more fully robust conversation about crime, what should agents be talking about to kind of make that case a little bit stronger?
It really can relieve a lot of pressure and a lot of uncomfortable situations. If you have an appropriate product with your organization and you do find that someone you did trust was actually embezzling funds, to know that you're protected and you're covered, that solves a lot of problems. And that can also be one of the factors that helps a company go from just trying to get by to being able to grow. The funds that were lost by an employee who was embezzling funds. The items that they really want to pay attention to is employee dishonesty. Employee dishonesty, and that's why the majority of the conversation so far has been around the internal theft of crime coverage, because the majority of losses, probably 80% at least, have been with employee dishonesty. And I would say 5 years ago, 90% of those losses were internal with employee dishonesty. They've scaled back a little bit because another part of crime coverage, computer fraud, and a newer part, social engineering, also known as fraud impersonation, there's a variety of different names depending upon the carrier, has started to escalate, and there's been more loss activity within those agreements. And that is something that's really important to make sure that a risk has addressed, because when it relates to computer fraud and specifically social engineering, you have agents and people within organizations within other countries whose sole responsibility, they're almost like companies, and their people go to work 9 to 5, and they probably have insurance plans and a 401k just like we do, and their only goal is to try to create social engineering losses. And it's like casting out a net, and they just try to tap as many companies. They don't dive into seeing the specifics of the company. It's just dial for dollars. And eventually one person will fall into the trap, because the social engineering loss is really caused more or less by human error rather than a technical breach. And that's an important item that companies really need to make sure their employees are trained on, are aware of, and are looking out for.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Mike, but we probably don't have the authority to do this, but I think you and me should at least create some sort of task force that creates better and more consistent naming across the insurance terminology. Because, like you said, like there's probably 8 different terms for social engineering or
Everything.
whatever. And can we be just a little more descriptive, please, on what it actually does?
Yeah.
But I think you're
That's,
right. So you touched upon that sort of third party, if we're going to use a fancy term,
mhm.
breach. Even though it is a smaller percentage, it is one that is constantly gaining traction, and they're just, companies are being bombarded with it. That might seem like a more likely maybe occurrence to people just based on perception because maybe they hear about it. Again, they
Yep.
might feel like that's more of a 60 or 70% chance of happening versus, like you said, the internal. How do you appropriately sort of, kind of plan for that from, those conversations and getting a business in line with the realities and covering each risk properly?
You first have to assess the exposures within each risk and bring to light where they're vulnerable. And that's a big thing because a lot of companies don't understand where they're vulnerable. And also, examples are always the best way to help show that. A lot of times, I remember when being a crime underwriter, and even now as an agent, we're selling it, and us having RPS now having a product. By the way, RPS product has full limit liability, full limit capacity for social engineering, which is a real big positive thing for the RPS product because the biggest problem with social engineering on the agent side was finding capacity and limit for social engineering. Everyone is so scared of offering up enough limit on social engineering because it happens so fast and it's such a large amount. That being said, that's a really positive note to make sure I highlight. But I think back to your question on how to understand where what a risk needs to address in terms of crime and things like that. Half of what helps market crime is the news. And you turn on the news, and once you're aware of what collar crime is and what kind of loss falls into crime insurance, you then pick up on it almost feels like every other day there's a story on the news that is related to or something that would be covered by crime insurance.
So basically, what I'm hearing, Mike, is one, you could get everybody together, watch the news. That sounds less fun. Maybe let's just go with like an embezzlement movie night, possibly. Pop some
Yeah.
popcorn. We can just go through some of the top ones and get some good examples. But all right, Mike, I got 2 more questions for you,
Sure.
and I'm curious as to what your personal perspective is on the crime landscape because it is changing so rapidly. It is an old coverage, but yet there are new threats coming into it every day. Where do you think you're excited about where it's heading? What we need to be paying attention to kind of stay up with all of the different things that are kind of challenging businesses?
Really good question. And there's a lot of unknown to that question, especially in how technology is so much more involved in how it can be used to facilitate losses. I remember when I was being interviewed for being a crime underwriter, the person who interviewed me said something that's always stuck with me. It said, in the crime insurance world, it's like cops and robbers. You're always one step behind the actual people, the robbers. So it's really it'll be very interesting to see how crime, how losses develop and what new trends develop and things like that. The only certainty that maybe I can say is that probably going to be more technology based because there's so many more systems used, software, things like that. Currency is now, I'm wondering if Bitcoin and cryptocurrency will start to play a part of, it's part of some companies' asset structure portfolios. Let's face it, there's just not much cash out there because I don't, you can probably look at your wallet. I know in my wallet, I probably have cash in it maybe 10% of the time, all reliance on electronic currency and transfer of funds. So that's probably where you're going to see the robbers look to manipulate and perform their theft or embezzlement or fraud.
All right, Mike, last question. We can throw commercial crime out the window if you want, but looking across the entire industry, I'm going to hand you a magic wand of sorts to really change or do anything you want, maybe a little bit differently, a little bit faster. What's that thing that you want to do and where's it going?
Well, I think that there's a lot of companies that are doing it right now, and RPS is one of them that has that online quoting and binding platform. It makes insurance so much efficient. It makes it so much faster, and it allows agents to find a solution very quickly, satisfy their clients' needs very quickly, and that's only going to continue to evolve. And there's going to be more products that are going to be available. The internet is providing a lot more information to make it easier for us as RPS with our platform or portal to provide an option with less questions and a more quote unquote efficient application. It's already starting to happen, and I look forward to seeing it grow and seeing it evolve and how that's going to end up.
I think it's been fantastic. I'm gonna leave it right there, sir.
Thank you, Joey. Thanks for having me.